We are so excited to be here today. We have a very special guest that we're excited to introduce and chat with, and that is Alex Segura. So I'm going to introduce him before I bring him on. Alex Segura is the best-selling and award-winning author of Secret Identity, one of my favorite novels, which the New York Times called wittily original and named an editor's choice. NPR described the novel as masterful, and it received starred reviews from Publishers Weekly, Kirkus, and Booklist. Secret Identity was also listed as one of the best mysteries of the year by NPR, Kirkus, Booklist, and South Florida Sun Sentinel, and more. And it was also nominated for the Lefty and Barry Awards as the best novel and won the LA Times Book Prize in Mystery Thriller category. So lots of awards. And his next novel, which we're going to first dive into, is the YA Spider-Verse adventure, Araña Spider-Man 2099 Dark Tomorrow, which is actually out now from Disney Books and Marvel Press. So I am going to bring him on.
Hello.
Hi. Hello.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being on with us. We're so excited to chat with you. Both Candace and I have read Araña Spider-Man 2099, and I know that Candace was listening to the audiobook, but
It's so good. Yeah, the audiobook. Not my book. Yeah.
Yeah.
The narration is really good.
Secret Identity was one of my favorite novels. Like when it came out, it just kind of really blew me away. And I remember I was like in the midst of like my like peak getting into comics, and then also reading the book and getting to know more about the comic industry, especially like early comic industry stuff. So
cool. Yeah, I'm so flattered. I mean, we got to chat about it a little bit in Chicago last year, and that was really nice to hear.
I'm going to say hi to the chat really quickly, and then we can dive into some questions. Hi, Brother John Comics. Hello. We have Heat Industries.
Hello.
Nice.
Pat Barbosa. Hi. I love
Gang's all here.
Yeah. So Araña Spider-Man 2099 is a YA novel. Do you want to kind of introduce anyone who's not familiar, kind of what the premise of it is?
Yeah, the big picture idea is Araña Spider-Man 2099 Dark Tomorrow follows Araña Corazón, who is a spider hero, but we catch her kind of at the beginning of her career. She's just gained her powers. She's lost her mentor, who is also named Miguel, and she's trying to find some path to figuring out how to be a superhero. Mm-hmm. She's also dealing with her own trauma. Her mother's disappeared. You know, she's feeling distant from her dad. So she goes to Times Square to see an exhibition of this ancient Cuban artifact called El Obelisco, and she witnesses it being stolen. And as she follows the robbers, she gets blasted by this strange energy, and it sends her into the future. It also really messes up her powers, and they're on the fritz. And so, like any smart spider hero, she says, let me reach out to the Spider-Man of this era. But unfortunately, the Spider-Man of that era, 2099, is Miguel O'Hara, who doesn't want to be Spider-Man anymore. So it's a story of a hero trying to learn how to be a hero, and an older hero trying to rediscover what made him a hero. And so they learn from each other. It's mostly Anya's journey, but I think Miguel is a very prominent co-star. And so it's kind of the spider team that I never expected to see, but I think it works out really well. They get along really well. I really loved writing their dynamic. So
that's really great. It's such a good coming of age, like YA novel, and it has so much excitement and humor to it. And I really love the fact that we have like two Latinx characters also, and there's just like so much of that imbued in the story. What was it like writing this novel with all of the deep comic history kind of around these characters?
It was, it was interesting. I'm a longtime comic fan. I grew up with Spider-Man. I have a really strong feeling about Miguel. Like seeing Miguel, I think I was like 12 or 13 when I first picked up Spider-Man 2099 #1, and that sense of identification was super important to me. Like seeing a Latinx hero, a Latinx Spider-Man, meant a lot to me, and then seeing Araña come up was really cool. So writing them together, I wanted to honor what had come before, but I also didn't want it to feel like you had to have a master's in Araña's history or Miguel's history. So what I did is I basically wrote the versions that were kind of, to me, the iconic versions. Like basically it's Miguel kind of at the end of his first series, and it's Anya at the beginning of her time, like right after her mentor dies. So I guess if you squint, it can fit into like continuity if you really wanted to. Like, but it's also its own continuity. So it gave me a little bit of freedom, but also I wanted to honor the character. So if you're familiar, like if you're a fan, they don't seem like strangers to you.
Which that was something that was really new to me, was both of these characters, because I had never read any of the,
oh, really? Cool.
Like I had never read 2099, and the most I had known about it was like seeing trailers for Across the Spider-Verse.
Yeah, me too. Literally the same.
And Candace, you're a little bit more familiar with Spider-Man, so what was that also like as reading that? Because Candace is the Spider-Man fan.
Oh yeah,
here.
Bring it on.
I was not familiar with Araña or Miguel O'Hara at all. Mostly just a lot of like Peter Parker, Miles Morales as of late, Gwen Stacy. So this was really refreshing for me just to have like new characters to be introduced to me, especially like Latinx characters, especially like I'm half Hispanic, so it's nice seeing that representation for sure. And then I just loved I thought it was just really digestible, like for a newer Spider-Man. Like I've especially like not being exposed to like their comics before, and it made me like really want to read the comics now. Definitely.
Yeah, no, that means a lot. I wanted to make it accessible to a casual fan, but I'm not saying you're a casual fan, but someone who doesn't know the characters super well. But also, like if you are a big like Araña or Spidey 2099 fan, there's a lot of Easter eggs spread out throughout the book.
Which is really exciting, because I think with anyone who is just, this kind of is a good introduction. And then like Candace is saying, it makes you want to dive deeper into these characters' histories, and then coming back and rereading the novel and finding all those Easter eggs is kind of like watching like the Marvel films and just like really putting things together. And I feel like that's one of the aspects about comics and that I really like, and those kind of stories and histories interwoven together. And so, you said that you mentioned that you were a huge like Spider-Man fan. What was it like? Kind of, you brought in some other characters into this book as well. What was it like? Even writing, you have a Peter Parker flashback as well. So, what did that feel like for you as such a big fan of Spider-Man?
Well, it was wild. It was there. I think there is a moment where Peter Parker shows up in flashback, and I think I texted a friend of mine who's also a writer, and I was like, I'm putting words in Peter Parker's mouth, and he is Spider-Man. It was just like a weird, like a crazy moment of like, wow, I wish I could go back in time and talk to like my 10-year-old self and be like, you're going to get to write Spider-Man at some point, because he was literally the first superhero comic I got, was an old Spider-Man reprint. And there are a lot of cool cameos in the book. I really wanted to evoke Spider-Verse without being like beholden to Spider-Verse. Like it obviously doesn't tie into that continuity, but if you like the movies and you like the idea of spider heroes teaming up across time to do, save the universe, then this is very much like up your alley.
Yeah, it definitely kind of fed into like if you're wanting more after watching Across the Spider-Verse, because you're just like, I just want more spider people.
I just want to play with the spider heroes some more. Yeah,
because they're all sorry. They're just like so all unique too. And I actually had kind of a question related, since you've worked on so many different Spider-Verse projects, because I noticed that you did work on the Spider-Verse comics. And I was kind of curious, like, writing more of Spider-Man in a novelization novelization format, and then writing the comics, kind of just like what that experience was like, or what, I guess, differences, I guess, for media.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's funny because even though Edge of Spider-Verse, that volume, the first issue, came out before the novel, I wrote the story, that Araña story, after I, obviously publishing and novels take much longer and are on a much different schedule. But the difference is with comics is you're collaborating with somebody else. You're collaborating with so many people. You're collaborating with not only the artist, but also the colorist, the letterer, the editor. And so it's really like akin to jamming and making music together. Whereas prose, I still had to answer to Marvel and Disney in terms of like editorial, but I was the one that sat down and wrote the draft in X amount of months and like was really living in their heads. It's really much more internal. Like Anya's struggles and her fears, like they're much more front and center in prose. Whereas, in comics you get the narration, but it's really it's a visual medium. So I was lucky to have a great artist. Kyle Mahado did the art on that Anya story, and it was really cool to me because it was like a bookend. This is the first time that Anya returns to the Araña costume, because before that she was Spider-Girl for a while. So I got to write kind of the beginning, and the way I wrote her in this Edge of Spider-Verse comic, it was like the same character. So I kind of treated it like it's in my head canon. It's the same.
Was it continuous?
Yeah.
She's in continuity in your head.
Yeah, and I got to write another one recently in Edge of Spider-Verse #4, which was cool.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, that's definitely on my list, especially after watching the movie lately and then reading your book. Like, it'll be cool kind of seeing writing for her in both of those medias for sure.
Yeah, it was really fun, and it was nice. It was like hanging out with an old friend, and like, what is her reason for being now in the Marvel universe? And it was really good it was an honor to like get to define that a little bit.
So you talked a little bit about kind of the editorial of Araña and Spider-Man 2099. When being approached to write this novel, did Marvel/Disney already have in mind what they wanted the storyline to be, or did you have a lot of creative input in that sense, especially when bringing in the other characters? When you're thinking about bringing in Miguel as her mentor, was that something that they wanted you to put into that, or were you given that creative freedom?
Yeah, it was really liberating. I think a lot of people have this misconception that if you're writing work for hire, it's like something where they just give you like a very detailed roadmap and you have to be like the writer monkey and just like do what they say. It's actually very different. Like, I think definitely my experience with Lucasfilm and my experience here with Marvel and Disney Press is they want to have different voices and they want to have different flavors and different takes on their characters. So it was because of the Poe book, and they were happy with how that turned out. Disney Books reached out and said, "Do you want to do a Marvel book?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd love to do Miguel or Anya," or we went back and forth on a whole list. But then the idea of pairing them struck me, and they really liked that idea. And then it just became like, what brings them together? Like, and which version of Miguel is it, and where in Anya's career is it? And I really love the idea of these two heroes at the opposite ends of their career. Like, Miguel has given up, and Anya really just wants to be better. She wants to learn, and she's stubborn and she's driven, and Miguel is despondent and kind of resigned, which I think the big message, and I'm not a big message writer, like I don't think about it beforehand, but after the fact I was like, oh, that's what I was trying to say, is we should never feel like we're too old to learn. We should always be open to learning from, I learn from my kids, and I still learn from people of any age. And I think that's kind of the theme and the idea of this book.
Well, and I really like that it brings these opposite ends, like you're speaking to, of them in different aspects of their career. And I feel like that allows a really nice contrast. And when kind of going through what they're learning about, it's for Araña, you just at the start and way more like excited and hopeful. I feel like that brings Miguel back into that kind of perspective. So I love seeing that kind of those perspectives like shifting and growing for both of those characters. We kind of have like skirted around the Across the Spider-Verse. So what was it like have you seen the film, first of all?
Yeah. It's great.
It's fantastic.
Yeah,
what was it like to watch that film, especially with the kind of like this multiversal like Spider-Verse, and seeing that version of Miguel O'Hara, which I believe is so different than the version that you've written in your novel, and kind of bringing those together in your mind?
It was wild. It was one of those things like, I guess I don't want to sound jaded, but it's similar to the feeling I had when I was watching the most recent Star Wars movie, having written the Poe prequel. Yeah. And I was like, oh, this is where my story kind of fits in. Like, it all is tied together. And I had a similar feeling watching Across the Spider-Verse, because even though my Miguel and the Miguel in the movie are different, it's still the same iconography. It's the same character. And so it felt really cool to know that a lot of people are going to be watching this movie and they're going to want to have something else. They want their thought is going to be, what's next? We can't see beyond the Spider-Verse yet. It's not done yet. So maybe you can read this book and kind of keep that energy going. So that was a thrill.
Well, and it feels really, in that sense, these different iterations of these characters, we get so many different comic runs written by different writers and artists, where you're experiencing Spider-Man 7 different ways, depending on the run. And so it feels very much like that. Like, you're still engaging, even though the mediums are different versus film and comics and prose, it feels like you're still engaging in a way that feels authentic to that history.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely agree with it. Just because, like, yeah, the Spider-Verse is so big, so it's like really cool seeing that the movie and the comics and now novelization can like all add to that. So it even makes the Spider-Verse like even bigger now.
Yeah, there's so many different versions and it's just ever expansive. And I think for what's funny is, a lot of people are like, oh, it's your version, so you didn't have to do a lot of research. I had to read a lot of comics, like reread them and revisit them just to because for me as a writer, I didn't want anyone to say, oh, this doesn't count because it doesn't fit,
Yeah.
So really, if you are like hardcore into the story of these characters, like you will find a place where this fits and could have happened. But also if you're a newcomer and you don't have like the baggage of that continuity, it's just hopefully a fun
It is,
story.
yeah.
Okay.
It's a fun ride.
Okay, good.
So
Thank
what
you.
was one of the challenges when writing this? Because you said you had to do a lot of research. What was something that you came up against while writing this that felt difficult?
Yeah, I guess the big challenge was, how do you make the stakes feel big?
Yeah.
Ideally, people are coming to this book from watching the movie, and the movie is as big as it gets. And so I didn't know what was in Across the Spider-Verse when I wrote the book, beyond what they'd released. So my thought was, how do I make this feel epic? And I'm still surprised they let me use the villains I used. Like Judas Traveler is not like who you would think of as an A-list like Spider-Man villain, but I think we also I tried to make him compelling and scary and creepy, and hopefully that worked enough that people are going to seek out his appearances and think, okay, this is an interesting character. And I think there's a fun Easter egg cameo of another spider hero like in the third act that I think you're at the point in the book where you're like, okay, this is what the book is.
Yeah.
And then they show up and you're like, oh, this is a bigger Spider-Verse story. And so that was fun. And yeah, I think the big challenge was like making the stakes matter and making it feel like, oh, this isn't just some random licensed story that they're just cranking out. This is something that actually is important.
Yeah. One of the things that I really felt while reading this, because I had also read Secret Identity, is that both of your main protagonists are females. They feel incredibly lived in,
Oh, good.
especially regarding like their Latin American, like Latinx roots. And I know that you're Cuban, and so that is coming through. But what was it like to write both of these characters and both of these women who, very different, but was there any kind of overlap when writing them and kind of internalizing them?
Yeah, they're similar in some ways. I think Carmen's obviously older, Carmen from Secret Identity, and Anya is just still in high school. But I didn't want Anya to just feel like Peter Parker, like a different version of Peter Parker. I wanted her to be strong-willed and driven and kind of seek out the superhero role. Whereas, I think Peter early on struggles very much with being Spider-Man. He's like, there's Spider-Man no more. He kind of goes back and forth a lot in his early days. And I don't think you have that with Anya. She knows she's going to be Araña, and this is like her calling. She just wants to get it right. And I found that really admirable. And Carmen is like that too. She's very driven, very focused, and she knows what her goals are, and she's not going to be dissuaded from that path. And in terms of like Latinx representation, I think I always wanted to feel lived in and not like, I think it's just who we are. It's just when you're writing a character, you're writing who they are. You're not writing them like holding up a sign and saying, this is what I am. Like you're showing it, you're not telling as much.
Yeah.
And so with Anya, it was just, sometimes she speaks a little Spanish. She talks about, her papi and the things that they did together and like, her background and, the food. It's like you're immersed in her world. You're not being like given a guide to what it's like. It's just you're just seeing it, you're experiencing it as it happens. I hope that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. I very much felt that throughout both books, and it was something that was really exciting to read because I don't always feel like sometimes you do get those stories where it's like the sign is being held up and you're like, this is who I am.
Yeah, it should just feel natural. Like this is okay. You're just reading a different kind of character.
So with Secret Identity, I mean, it has been all over the place and has gotten so many awards, and it's so exciting to see. And Carmen Valdez I absolutely just love her so much.
Thank you.
So for anyone who hasn't read Secret Identity, would you mind sharing a little bit about what Secret Identity is?
Yeah. Secret Identity is set in 1975, and it's a story of Carmen Valdez, who's a queer Cuban-American woman that moves from Miami to New York, and she's a lifelong comic book fan. She's in her late 20s when she moves to New York. She grows up reading comics. Comics are like an integral part of her coming of age in Miami, learning English from reading comics and just having this real bond with her dad over comic books. And she wants to write comics. And so she moves to New York and she gets this entry-level job as an executive assistant or secretary for this company called Triumph Comics. And if Marvel and DC are like A and B, Triumph is like D or E, like just, a low rent publisher that is just cranking stuff out. But she sees it as her foot in the door. And part of that is pitching her ideas to her boss, who's the editor-in-chief, this guy named Jeffrey Carlisle. And so we when we meet Carmen, she's following up with Carlisle about an idea, and he basically says, look, just stop sending me ideas. Like, I have another plan for you. I have freelancers lined up outside the door, friends I have to keep fed. Please just stop, leave me alone. And it's heartbreaking because as any of us can relate to, when you have a dream like so burned into your mind and it gets pushed away, it's heartbreaking. And so she goes home and is surprised when a coworker shows up at her apartment for various reasons. It's a little creepy that you just showed up in my apartment. And B, we're kind of friends. We're like work buddies, like cigarette buddies, but not best pals. This guy, Harvey, and he says that Carlisle has hired him to write the first issue of a new female superhero. He doesn't know what it is. He wants Harvey to come up with it. But Harvey also knows that Carmen loves comics and that she wants to write. So he basically asks her to go in on this with him and create a character together. The only catch being that she has to do it anonymously because Carlisle just basically banned her from writing comics. So that's something I really wanted to spotlight. Like, what would we do? What would someone do if their dream was like dangled in front of them with that caveat? And I know what I would do. I would probably do it. I'm obviously not a woman in that situation in that time, but I think, and then so Carmen does agree to do it. And they spend the weekend basically brainstorming, and Carmen has notebooks and ideas, so many ideas from years and years, and pours herself into these scripts. And she comes back to work the following Monday and sees that Harvey has turned in 6 scripts with only his name on it, she knew that was the plan, but it's so jarring to see it on paper. And they create this character called the Legendary Lynx. And the Lynx is basically kind of a street level hero like Daredevil or Moon Knight or the Cat, who came out from Marvel like a few years before the era of this book. And it becomes a huge hit for Triumph. But the only problem is that Harvey is murdered. And so the only person that knows...
Small problem.
Yeah, minor detail. Her friend is murdered. Yeah, the only person that knew that Carmen was involved is Harvey, and she can't really mention it to Carlisle because it would just go against everything he told her to do. So it spurs Carmen on to become this amateur sleuth and figure out what happened to her friend. A, because he's her friend and she feels bad, but also she wants to reclaim this character that's so deeply embedded in her. And one of the cool things about the book, I think, is that we have sequences from the Lynx comic. So you're reading the novel and then you hop into the actual comic. So you're kind of seeing what Carmen's subconscious is doing in the writing of the comics as you see her investigate the crime. Which
I absolutely loved the comics. I know, Candace, you were listening to the audiobook, so you didn't get to necessarily see the...
she did a cool job with those comic sequences, I thought, in the audiobook.
Oh, yeah. It's very immersive. It's just like you could hear a lot of like sounds, like so instead of reading the sounds, you hear them. So it's really cool in that way. But of course, like after listening to it, I have 100% have to get it so I can have that experience as well.
Yeah, the art is by Sandy Jarrell, who is amazing, and letters by Taylor Esposito. And Sandy's perfect because he knows the history of comics, but he wasn't trying to like imitate. So it doesn't look like low rent Frank Miller or him trying to do Gene Colan or someone from that era. It's him, it's Sandy, but it's done in a style that's so evocative of the time. Like he gets the vibe more so than just trying to like imitate.
When did you know that you wanted to integrate like the comic within the prose as well? Because I feel like that's what to me I thought was really intriguing about that. People who are coming to this for the thriller noir aspect and have never read comics before and are also getting a little bit of a taste of what reading comics can feel and look like and engaging with that medium. And so I thought that is like a really cool way of like sneaking in and like getting new readers to maybe test something out that they wouldn't otherwise gravitate towards. Because you have so many genres kind of blending in this novel. How did that kind of come about? Was that already at like the the beginning of your ideas?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's honestly something that popped into my mind like 20 years ago when I was in college reading Cavalier and Clay. Not in the way of, oh, I'm going to do this. It was more like I was reading this novel that I loved that kind of visualized or brought to life an era of comics. And if you haven't read Cavalier and Clay, please do so. It's Michael Chabon. It's a fantastic, like it won the Pulitzer, unless I'm wrong.
No, I
But
think you're right on that one.
yeah, okay, good. Yeah, it's a great novel. It was one of the first like times I read comics in that medium, and my one gripe, and it's not really a gripe, was like I really want to see the comics. I want to see the escapist comics, and eventually they did that as their own thing, like a side project. But that idea stuck with me, and when I finished up my PI series, the Pete Fernandez books, and I was working on the Poe Dameron book, and I knew my next book was going to be a standalone, or I thought it was going to be a standalone. And that's when I started getting the idea of writing a noir set in comics. And then the idea came back to me, and I was like, well, if I'm going to do this set in comics, why don't I show the comics that they're creating? And then that, when it paired with the idea of Carmen, like this creator that is silenced not through her own ideas or control, but because somebody basically cuts her out of the process, it felt that much more evocative. And so then I messaged Sandy and I was like, would you be up for this? Because when we were pitching the book, I needed to show like proof of concept. And so I had the outline and sample chapters, but I wanted to show a page by Sandy. And so that the page where it's the Lynx kind of crashing through a window and looking at the message from Mr. Void written in the mirror, that was the one he did as a sample page. And I got Taylor to letter it. And so it was like kind of, this is what the book is going to be. And I think that's what really helped like get it over the hump.
I really like enjoyed that experience of seeing that with you kind of touched on it in the beginning of these kind of experiences that Carmen is coming, these obstacles and being cut out of the process. I think so much of it is also due to the sexism in the industry in the 70s. And to me, I felt like the way that you wrote her experience, especially with men and even her coworker, felt
sadly
really resonated.
yeah, I can imagine. Thank you.
And so that's something that really struck me as just like a woman in publishing and you know, and sometimes the comic industry as well, just kind of how much stuff has changed and then not as much.
I think about microaggressions a lot, like the way people talk to each other and they don't even think that this might be offensive, and there's so much of that. And I also had to be really thoughtful about the writing of a character that is not, I am not like that character. Like Carmen and I share a lot, but we also are very different. Like obviously I wasn't even alive in 1975 and I'm a straight man and she's a queer woman. But for that, I really spent time with women that worked in comics in that era. And I got to walk them through what happened and what I thought the story would be and kind of get a gut check. Like, does this make sense? Or am I like totally off base here? And that was really helpful. And having, you know, authenticity readers and just making sure that just because I thought it made sense, it makes sense to the people that it would really matter to the most.
Well, I think that's so important when writing these kind of characters. There's so many conversations often about who gets to write what story. And I'm a firm believer of if you're doing the research and like you're saying, you're talking to the people who were a part of that experience, you're having authenticity readers, it really shows in the work that you've published because the characters feel so real and resonant with at least just like female, like me as a woman reader. I really felt that way.
It means the world to me that you read the book and felt like it was accurate and honest and felt real. I think a lot of writers complain that they're being limited in some way, and there's no limit. Like you can write whoever you want. You have to own up. You have to do your home. Yeah, do it well. You have to do your homework, and you have to be ready for the readers to decide whether you did it right or not, you know. And I think sometimes authors will use an authenticity reader as a shield and say, well, I got an authenticity reader, so then it's fine. And it doesn't always work out that way. Like sometimes, you know, you have to be really careful and mindful of what you're doing. And I think being thoughtful and transparent is the challenge. Definitely.
But worth like trying to rise to,
for sure. Yeah.
And can be really rewarding when it's done right. With also these other aspects of like the comic book industry, obviously you weren't alive in the 70s, like, or you were, you know, not the
not yet. Yeah.
So what was that like trying to capture that moment in the comic industry versus your own experience working in it?
Yeah, it was interesting. I wanted to pick a time where comics weren't as prevalent as today. You know, I mean, comics are everywhere now in a good way, like their movies and TV shows and their, you know, card games, video games, everything, like, and now the idea of comics is different. Like now when I create a character, I have the hope that it'll become a show or more. Whereas in 1975, it was really, you either went to Marvel or DC, or you took a steep drop and worked for these smaller companies, but there was no like avenue to do creator own work or do your own stuff and own it and then hope for it to become something else. And there was no direct market yet. There were little conventions, but there wasn't like San Diego Comic-Con in terms of what it is today. And there wasn't like a comic shop there weren't comic shops everywhere where you could find every issue. Like if you missed it on the newsstand, you missed it. You just won't get that issue because it's gone. And also I think the industry itself people were worried that it was not going to last. And I wanted to give a snapshot of an industry that people thought was dying, and obviously didn't. It kept going and it thrived and became something else. But I really wanted to show that contrast. And so to do that accurately, I had to. Was like the most journalistic book I'd ever written, which was not what I had expected. Like when I first started writing it, I was like, well, I know comics and I know how to write noir, so it's going to be easy. And I just wanted it to be accurate. So I spoke to creators like Jerry Conway and Louis Simonson and people that worked in comics at that time and still obviously create great stuff today, but they were able to give me a lot of color and detail. And then I had to read a lot of books about the history of comics and like things that, even I read stuff about the 50s crackdown on horror comics, and that was inspirational in different ways. And I'm a pretty obsessive writer, so I have to like immerse myself in a subject. And like, if I'm not obsessed, I probably won't write it. So I'm glad it was something I was passionate about.
Yeah, it definitely shows, and it was really cool to just get a glimpse in that period of the industry. Aside from your love of comics, that really shows through in Secret Identity. Where did you draw inspiration from? I know you've written noir before, but where was coming up for you while writing Secret Identity?
Yeah, I think the stuff that really motivated me. I guess the shorthand I use is Secret Identity is basically like, what if someone like Patricia Highsmith wrote a novel in the comic book industry, or like Megan Abbott wrote a novel in the comic book industry. And I love Megan. I love her work. I'm a huge fan. But I think something she does really well is she brings the elements of noir into areas or industries that you wouldn't expect to read a noir story. So it's like gymnastics, like high school gymnastics, or science or dance. And I was like, well, what if Megan Abbott wrote a comic book noir? And that was kind of my guiding light. I don't think I write like Megan Abbott. I think we're very different writers, but I think that was the shorthand was like, what if it was a noir, the elements of a noir in comics? And I wanted to kind of contrast the, not the colorful because it's black and white, but the kind of wow factor of the comic pages with the kind of gritty and grimy and dark reality of the story itself, and like showing the underbelly of like the people that make these comics. Yeah,
which the characters were really exciting to read. And then also you have like the murder to it, which
and there's layers.
The small.
Well, I didn't want to have like a huge body count either. I didn't want it to feel like an action thriller. Like I thought this is like, how would normal people react to like a murder? Because she's an amateur. She's not a detective. Like what's going to propel her to solve this crime? And I think the reason she does it is to reclaim this thing that's literally like a part of her heart. Like this character is so much hers. Like she couldn't think of anyone else writing it. So
there was such a deep passion and like drive within Carmen that was so inspiring to read, and also just like really drives the story because you're just rooting for her like throughout. What was something that kind of surprised you the most in that process of writing Secret Identity? Was it sounds like it kind of might have been like how much research you ended up having to do for this?
That was a surprise,
yeah.
But there were other surprises. I'm a big outliner. Like I outline pretty heavily, and to the point where like with the next novel, it became almost the first draft. But I leave enough room that if the characters like interest me and do something different, I can follow them along. And my new book is a testament to that, because the first draft is nothing like the outline. Like the characters just started moving around and I'm just kind of following them with a notebook. But there's a character that you meet very briefly early on, and I just wrote her initially as like this very mysterious woman. Like you don't know much about her, and I didn't think she was going to show up. And then she shows up again, and she became almost like super integral to the last act. And I'm being vague because I don't want to spoil anything, but it's those are the pleasant surprises when the characters kind of catch you off guard and start doing their own thing. And Yeah, and I didn't realize until I wrote it that it was almost like this meta commentary on IP, the idea of like intellectual property, like who owns characters and like what happens, like, like what happens when credit is stolen. And there's a sad history in comics of creators, inventing character, like Bill Finger is probably the most obvious example, like this guy that co-created Batman and lived in obscurity and was only recently given credit. There's a history of that, and so I wanted to just show that in some way, but I didn't think it was going to be this meta-textual commentary on IP, but that's what it is.
You're like, that's where we landed. And I feel like with that too, it's just so devastating and heartbreaking when you do find out those stories, or like the history behind that in comics, because like you said, it's not something that is, unknown. It's incredibly familiar, especially to that industry more than anything.
There's a book called the 10-Cent Plague by David Hadju, and it's about that crackdown on horror comics in the 50s by Congress and how it led to the creation of the Comics Code of America, which was a governing body in terms of content. And so the book starts with the author interviewing this woman, and this was really what spurred me to create Carmen, or what spurred Carmen to pop into my mind. He interviews this woman who worked in comics before the crackdown, and he asks her, well, why didn't you come back? And she was like, there was nothing there for me anymore. Like, it was gone. Like, the industry I knew was gone, and I had no place. Nobody knew I had done this stuff, and nobody wanted a horror writer to come and work on whatever. And so that's what really, I read that, I was like, okay, this is who Carmen is kind of like. And I think that feeds into Carmen in the present, and also, what kind of concludes the book. You get a sense of why she makes the choices she makes at the end.
So we're after like Secret Identity, you have hopefully next summer it's coming out, Alter Ego. And that is, from what I remember when I first learned about it, it can be a standalone. It's kind of a sequel. And can you speak a little bit about Alter Ego and what is to come?
Yeah. Alter Ego. I'm calling it a follow-up. I was saying spiritual sequel, but that feels kind of cheesy. But you can read Alter Ego on its own, and it'll be hopefully entertaining in and of itself. But if it's read paired, it pairs nicely with Secret Identity in that it's set in the modern day. And if you read Secret Identity, it picks up immediately after, but not in a Back to the Future 1 and 2 kind of way where you have to like keep reading. But if you've read the first one, you can ease right into the next one. And it's about this woman, Annie Bustamante, who is a storyboard artist for film. And we learn that she used to work in comics. Something happened that pulled her away, and she just found this new lucrative path, and she's fulfilled. She's happy. She has a daughter. She lives in New York. But we know that she's a fan of this obscure 70s character that had a very short run for a very low rent company called Triumph. And the character's called the Legendary Lynx. And so we know she loves that character. And so there's an announcement that this media company, Triumph Entertainment, is relaunching their line of comics with an eye towards TV and film. And the first property they're going to relaunch is the Lynx. And then there's a social media wave of people basically saying, Annie needs to do this book. Everyone knows she's a fan. She's a great artist. She used to work in comics. So she takes the gig. And, the same way that any creative person takes a work for hire gig, like you love the character for some reason and you want to work on it. But as she gets deeper and deeper into the assignment, she learns that there's much more to the story of who created this character, who owns this character. And it's really a story about fandom. Like, what happens when the people that work on the things we love are not great people? How do we divide the idea from the person? And I told my editor this when I talked to him a couple of weeks ago. I was like, well, it's a book about generational trauma and parenthood. And he was like, I don't know if that's like the most selling topic. Like, it's a mystery. There's a murder. There's a mystery. And Carmen does show up, but she's not the star. And she's in there. In there. She shows up later, and she's important when she does show up. But I didn't want it to feel like it's Carmen and Friends, or it's like Secret Identity 2020. It's a very different book. It's totally different. It's not. It's a wider lens. Like, more stuff is happening. And part of it is also she collaborates with this showrunner that the company's hired. This very this maligned showrunner who has a very checkered past, and then she has to kind of navigate that. Like, what is it like working with a miserable, not great person who is talented? Like. And I think that's something that all creatives have to grapple with to some degree, as
I can relate.
Yeah. Or do you work in publishing as well?
No, I work
Okay.
I work in marketing.
Oh yeah.
So I work as a designer, and I just I've definitely experienced that before.
Yeah, it's hard because you're like, wow, this person's really gifted, but also, wow, they're miserable, and this is not fun for me anymore. So, and there will be like comic book interstitials as well from the modern like Lynx reboot that Annie is drawing.
That is really exciting. I've been really fascinated with the like just like the question of like how you divide the art from like the artists, especially when they're like problematic. I've been reading this book called Monsters by
Yes, I read it. Yeah, that was part of my
Yeah.
research. Yeah.
Was it really? Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
because so that's I'm very steeped in that kind of those questions right now, and so it's kind of exciting to hear
Yeah.
that is a layer to
What was
alternative.
what was your takeaway? Like, what is your solution as a consumer of art?
Okay, so I'm only at the beginning
Okay.
of it. So I read like
Okay.
probably about like 50 pages in, so I haven't finished it, and I feel like I'm
no pressure.
what I find really interesting that at least in the beginning that she's kind of walking us through as readers, Claire, it makes this mention of depending on the time of the day and the place that I'm at and who we're actually talking about, it's like the opinion changes on how we're engaging with that art, especially if it's a problematic person. And so I'm at that place where I'm like, I don't quite have an answer yet. And
it's okay not to. I don't have an answer either.
And
I read the book.
Yeah, right. And I kind of feel like that's likely where it's going to end up like leaving me, but I am walking away with like more questions and like kind of really pondering it in different lights. And so that has been exciting reading Monsters, because I'm sitting there kind of like, wait, what do I actually think about this? And where there's maybe artists that you engaged with for a period of time, but then like their work changes and you don't like it. So you're like, oh, it's fine. Like that feels better than versus someone who's creating art where you're like, oh, I still really love this. And what do you kind of do with that?
Yeah, especially when the art has had such an impact on certain period. Like there's just the nostalgia factor. Like if you grew up watching certain movies or listening to certain albums, like, but I also feel like instinctually, when to detach. Like sometimes your mind and body knows how to do it before you like can contextualize a thought and realize, oh, I'm not listening to this person anymore. It almost just kind of happens naturally. But it's I don't think there's a universal answer to all that.
Definitely not. And one other point that she was making of like how social media has really shifted the way that we kind of learn about people's how like bad they are, that kind of cancel culture. She mentioned how just at it, because she's of a different generation and not my generation,
right?
That you had to really seek out biography, and biography really happens to us now. And I don't know that I totally am like beholden to that idea, just because I still feel like we're in these echo chambers that you place yourselves in. So there is a bit of like, you're learning people's biographies potentially accidentally, but you're also like, I'm signing up for Twitter and I'm following these certain kind of people in which like we're in these circles. I don't know.
No, it's a fascinating book. I think about it a lot. Yeah.
I need to read that. Yeah, because I feel like that, it's so relevant nowadays. And like for me, a lot of times it's often like nostalgia is such a big factor in that. And when I either hear something about someone that, did something that or created something that I loved, and I find out, oh, maybe they weren't actually the best person. It's always like kind of like heartbreaking. Like I feel offended for my childhood, but then it's like, it's just so true though. It's like that, like when we were kids, like we didn't have social media like that. So it's like then that's also like has to do with like fact checking too, where you're like, well, is this actually true? Or is just how the public is also perceiving this person? It's like really depends.
Yeah.
Each situation is really different. So yeah, I would definitely be interested to read the book because I think it's a really interesting conversation.
It's a really well done book. I read it pretty fast. So, it's just interesting. It's an interesting topic because it's something I think everybody grapples with to some degree.
Yeah.
What are some other books or things that went into your research for Alter Ego?
Obviously a lot of comics. I was reading a lot of different comics. I was reading a lot of Daredevil comics and a lot of different like comic book histories, but more modern histories about, I think, the film and TV aspect of, how the industry evolved from where it was in like the Secret Identity era to the modern day. I read a lot of like pop culture histories of different kinds of companies. Like there's a great book. I'm blanking on the name. I'll have to look it up. about the history of TSR, which is the company that initially did Dungeons and Dragons, and then it was sold to Magic the Gathering, Wizards of the Coast. But kind of like, the
I
idea.
recently got into Magic, so I'm like,
yes. But the idea that, like creative people don't always make the best business people, and like what happens when creatives like have their great ideas taken away by the business side, but the business side then does well. Like, how do you? It kind of ties into what we were talking about with Monsters. Like, how do you like sync up with that, knowing that the creatives were left behind, but the ideas would not have been so huge or successful without the business side. So just a lot of like this, it sounds boring now that I'm saying it out loud, but a lot of these company histories and pop culture histories, like whether it's like role-playing games or video games, like there's this great book called The Console Wars about Sega and Nintendo.
A documentary too, I feel
think it might be, but it was
I love
book.
that, but
It was a great book, and it's interesting just to see how these companies like were using IP and characters to go to war with each other, and in the same way that Marvel and DC did for many years. Those were some of the ones that come to mind.
Yeah, and that's also really relatable in the sense of like as being like a creative person and like just knowing other people in the industry was like creatives can take things of course like very personally when it's like, oh, this is my work and everything. And so like I've even learned this as a creative, just like sometimes you have to know when to put the strategy ahead, the business side ahead of like what's going to be best for the company or for the end user. And it's really interesting in that way, just because, like oftentimes creators are like, but I love it. You have to really like, it's
I'm thankful to have like a marketing background, like so I can kind of like differentiate like my creative desires and like what is actually going to like work, which isn't to say I write to sell, like, but I write, it helps you kind of keep yourself in check. And also one book that was really important of fiction was Gabrielle Zevin's Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, which just blew my mind. It was just like so good. And I was like, wow, this like feels like it's like it felt like it was in conversation with the book, even though I didn't intend for that to happen. But that book was really important to my writing.
Oh, that's cool.
That was a really good book. I loved, just like how much it was drawing into like kind of like pop culture and nostalgia in games. And then also this like larger culture, like especially in like the third act of that novel. I have so many feelings on that one.
I love that book. We could do a whole episode on that book.
And then I would love to, I know Candace, wanted to ask you some questions about like the Archie stuff that you've done. Go for it.
Wait. Oh, okay. I wasn't sure.
I'm ready.
First. Yes. Okay. So of course, like when I was doing my research, I was just looking at like the work that you've done for Archie, because anytime that I get to talk to someone that's done any work on Archie, because I'm a huge Archie fan.
Oh, I love it.
Although.
I saw the Katie Keene. You have like a Katie Keene #1 or like.
Well, her and I both collect Katie Keene together, and then I got original art of Katie Keene from Andrew Pepboy.
Andrew, he's great.
Yeah.
But I was seeing, what was it? You did work on like the Archie's series, which I feel like a fake fan of Archie because I haven't read that yet. But I was kind of curious. Like that's another, I guess, example of like another established character. And I know a lot of times like the ones that are kind of different from the more comic strip ones that are more like they've been more modernized. I guess like kind of there's like anything from that experience that like was interesting for just writing for Archie in general. Because it's been done by so many different people, so many stories. It's another like Archie verse of characters. So just kind of what that was like.
For me, it was awesome because I grew up with Archie, but Archie was the first comic. Like Spider-Man was the first superhero comic, but Archie was the first comic book. Like getting that digest at the checkout line. Like I remember vividly getting a Betty and Veronica double digest. Like my mom got it for me, I think, at a Publix in Miami. So to me, I worked at DC and then I went to Archie, and a few people were like, "Well, why are you going to Archie? Like you were doing publicity for Superman and Batman." But for me, like Archie was as big of a character because it felt like so iconic, and it's the kind of IP that anyone recognizes, in terms of awareness. Like people maybe haven't read the comics in decades, but they still know like Archie is in a love triangle with Betty and Veronica. Jughead eats burgers. Reggie is a jerk. They're very like defined, which is amazing and rare. so I love the characters, and I also like what writing comedy is so much harder than writing drama. I don't want to minimize what I do mostly, which is writing dramatic fiction, but like writing a joke, like a gag in 6 pages is really hard. And so writing those comics like really taught me how to truncate and focus my writing. And then that's really helped me in other stuff. But it was a great opportunity to mix things I loved, like Archie and music, and do stuff like Archie meets the Ramones and Archie meets the B-52s. And the Archie's book was fun because we had different bands like each issue. So we'd have Blondie and the Monkees, and it's one of those things that I'm really proud of. And the funny thing is that whole series is really about failure. It's about like not achieving the dream you want, but then still having your friends, and like the lesson of that. Like I said before, it's like something I realized after the fact. I was like, oh, I'm writing about not succeeding, and that's okay, because if you still have your friends and your people around you, it's fine. But yeah, I love those characters. I mean, I was just reading some Archie stories to my kids before bed, so it's like they're just so digestible and fun.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, that was my intro to comics for sure. Like literally like the same story of like my mom got me the Archie Digest from the Kmart like checkout and everything, and yes, now here we are.
Yeah, and there's what I loved is like it was like a sitcom. There's no real.
Exactly.
I mean, eventually there was continuity, like with the new Riverdale stuff and the show, but like those classic digests, like there's no continuity. Like Archie is great at math in one book, and then he's terrible at math in the next book. But it's about the humor, and it's about the characters themselves are so defined that the details don't really matter.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we have a question from Heat Industries about your comic, The Rejects Meet the Rejects. He was wondering if you could give a quick summary about it.
Yeah. So The Rejects is a digital comic that this company Interpop, which has sadly since folded, but it's 6 issues I think are still up on their website. And it's set in their bigger universe of superheroes. And I guess the biggest comps I can use are, it's kind of like the New Mutants meets the Teen Titans with, and the theme is really found family. It's these heroes who don't really fit in wherever they're from, and the leader of the group brings them together to give them a home, but also to fight bigger threats. But as the mystery unfurls, you realize that the people that the team trusted and the people that the team thought were their allies were actually manipulating them. So it's things that I think teenagers can relate to, or I could have related to as a teenager. Like, the people you trust don't maybe have your best interests at heart, but it's all like with a superhero wrapping.
That sounds really fun, especially by like New Mutants meets Teen Titans and Found Family.
Yeah,
I love it.
Oh, good. Yeah. No, definitely. I love New Mutants, especially like the Claremont Sienkiewicz stuff and Vita Ayala stuff. Recently was great. So yeah, teen superheroes are my jam.
I love it. So what do you have coming up for you? So you have and there's a Star Wars comic coming out.
Yes. Next week, Star Wars Return of the Jedi 40th anniversary one-shot Rebellion, and it stars Admiral Akbar, who everybody loves, and it's about an assassination attempt on Mon Mothma, like right before the Battle of Endor. And it was really fun for me because I got to use a lot of characters that showed up in Poe Dameron Freefall. But since this happens like right before Return of the Jedi or around that time, they're much younger. So it's like Shara Bay and Kes Dameron, who are Poe's parents. There's a few Easter eggs if you read the novel, but it's a fun like conspiracy thriller in the Star Wars universe. And Matt Horak is the artist. And it was really great. And it's great to work on, and it's out next Wednesday.
That's really exciting. Guys, you have to pick it up.
Yes,
what other projects are coming up for you that people should expect?
This week saw the release of Night Terror's Green Lantern #1, and I got to work on that with Jeremy Adams, who's the regular Green Lantern writer, and I wrote the second story, which is about Sinestro, and it's part of the bigger Night Terrors event where a villain called Insomnia basically takes over the minds of the entire DCU and haunts them through their dreams. And so we get to kind of experience what Sinestro's worst fears are. And it's really interesting because he's always been the villain of fear. And so like what makes the Master of Fear afraid, and what does he struggle with, especially now with the Green Lantern series? What we found is that Hal Jordan and Sinestro are stranded on Earth. So like how does this guy who has destroyed galaxies grapple with being stuck on Earth, like this place he hates, and how does that make him feel? And so the first part is out. The second part comes out next month. And earlier this month, I had a story, an Araña story in Edge of Spider-Verse #4, and that was a fun kind of new status quo for her. You know, she teams up with Madam Web and Spider UK, and I got to write Mayday Parker, who is the alternate future daughter of Spider-Man.
That is so fun.
Yeah, that was cool. Yeah. Thanks.
And I am obviously very excited for Alter Ego when that comes out next
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will send it to you when it's ready to be read.
Yeah, I literally have a TBR going now from after the end of the show. Like, I need to check out this. This is all so good.
Yeah. Awesome.
So my last question is, if you could write, you've written so many characters, but if there was one that you can kind of write next, like what character would you want to write?
I would have said like Spider-Man, not counting my little cameo in Araña, but I'm actually writing a Spider-Man story that's going to be out in October. Yeah, it's going to be in the Marvel Zombies, Black, White, and Blood. Yeah. So it was really scary. It was like, what is the lowest possible point I can bring Peter Parker to? And it was, I really hope it honors like the legacy of the character and it feels classic, but it's also got zombies in it. So that was really intense. And Javi Fernandez is doing the art. So that was really cool. Aside from that, I would love to write a Batman story. I love Batman, and I love the X-Men, and maybe I'll get to write something in the X-Men universe soon.
That would be
so fun. Yeah, I'm like a super X-Men fanboy. Like I reread the Chris Claremont stuff at least once every couple of years.
I am still reading some of the Claremont stuff, but Hickman is what got me into X-Men, and it's just fantastic. So where can people find you? Yeah,
you can find me on my website, alexsegura.com. I'm also on Twitter, as long as it lasts, at @Alex_Segura. And
well, now that we have Threads, who knows?
Yeah, I'm on Threads too, and Instagram at Alex Segura Jr. And I'm also on Blue Sky at Alex Segura. But yeah, it's just so many social media platforms. Like I'm everywhere. You'll find me. If you go to my website, that'll take you wherever you want to go.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with us and talking all things like Spider-Man and comics and Secret Identity. It was so much fun. And
thanks for having me.
Definitely want to have you back with some of your other projects.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Anytime. This was really fun. Thanks so much.
Of course. Bye, guys.
Bye.